At 2:50 in the morning, on August 1, 1947, a B-25 bomber fell from the sky near Kelso, Washington, with two Army Air Forces intelligence officers trapped inside. Minutes earlier, Captain William Davidson and First Lieutenant Frank Brown had left McCord Field, after questioning two men tied to one of the strangest flying disc stories ever. Inside Tacoma's Winthrop Hotel, those officers had examined chunks of rock-like material, said to have fallen from a damaged object over Maury Island. Hours later, both investigators were dead. According to one FBI witness account, a box holding alleged fragments had been placed in the Army vehicle, carrying Davidson and Brown away from the hotel. Another Bureau memorandum later stated, the crashed bomber was definitely not carrying parts of a flying disc. Somewhere between the hotel room, McCord Field, and a burning aircraft, the evidence trail became uncertain. Why? June 21, 1947, is where the story supposedly begins, 3 days before Kenneth Arnold's famous Mount Rainier sighting helped launch America's flying saucer obsession. Harold Dahl said he was working from a boat near Maury Island, accompanied by crewmen, his teenage son, and a dog when 6 large, donut-shaped objects appeared overhead. Among them, one craft seemed damaged or unstable, while the others circled close around it. Suddenly, thin metallic material began drifting down. Moments afterward, heavier debris allegedly followed, striking the boat, injuring his son, and killing the dog. Photographs, Dahl also claimed, were taken during the encounter. None became reliable public evidence. Afterward, Fred Krisman, Dahl's associate in the salvage business, said he visited the area, recovered fragments, and saw another unusual craft. Already, the case contained nearly every ingredient that would keep it alive for decades. An encounter dated before Arnold's famous sighting, alleged physical evidence, missing photographs, military interest, a threatening stranger, and eventually 2 real deaths. However, almost every extraordinary element rested on testimony, rather than independent proof. Precisely there lies the reason Maury Island matters. An apparently fragile story somehow became one of the foundational legends of modern American UFO folklore. Anyway, that is the real mystery. If you enjoy investigations that give strange evidence a fair hearing before tearing into it, like the video, subscribe, and support the channel. Apparently, the algorithm still demands tribute. Returning to June, Dahl's version deserves to be heard in the form that made it famous. From his position on the boat, he said the 6 objects were enormous ring-shaped machines, hanging above the water. Beneath one of them, pale material supposedly fluttered down first, before darker and heavier pieces began falling. Nearby, the debris allegedly struck the vessel hard enough to damage it, hurt his son's arm, and kill the dog. During the encounter, Dahl said he took photographs. In his later account, he reached shore with something far more valuable than a strange story, physical debris and pictures that could, at least in theory, prove it. Krisman then entered the account, claiming he returned to Maury Island, collected additional material, and saw one of the objects himself. Soon afterward came the detail that would become inseparable from later UFO folklore. Reportedly, a dark-suited stranger met Dahl, seemed to know private details of the encounter, and warned him not to discuss what had happened. Problem is, the stranger left no independently verified trail. Neither a name, a corroborating witness, nor a surviving contemporary record establishes that meeting. Meanwhile, the promised photographs never became usable evidence. Yet, the story reached exactly the person most likely to take it seriously. Kenneth Arnold had reported 9 unusual objects near Mount Rainier on June 24, and newspapers had turned his description into a national sensation. Publisher Raymond Palmer heard about the Maury Island story and paid Arnold $200 to investigate it in Tacoma. Together, Arnold and United Airlines pilot E.J. Smith met Dahl and Krisman inside the Winthrop Hotel. Several fragments presented during the affair were rough, dark, and rock-like, rather than unmistakable pieces of advanced machinery. Having recently reported his own sighting, Arnold did not simply dismiss the case. Through military contacts, he reached Lieutenant Frank Brown of 4th Air Force Intelligence. Brown arrived in Tacoma with Captain William Davidson on July 31st. For the first time, the Maury Island story had moved beyond publishers, witnesses, and curious pilots into an official Army Air Force's intelligence inquiry. Crucially, official interest did not prove the story was genuine. Reports of unidentified aircraft could matter to military intelligence without requiring extraterrestrial visitors. There, in room 502, Davidson and Brown listened to the claims and examined the alleged debris. Later, an FBI witness account recorded a box of alleged flying disc fragments being removed from a car trunk and placed into the Army vehicle that collected the officers. About 2 in the morning, on August 1st, Davidson and Brown left McCord Field aboard a B-25, bound for Hamilton Field in California. Roughly 50 minutes later, the aircraft crashed near Kelso. Federal records describe the left engine burning an exhaust stack, the wing catching fire, and structural failure involving the wing and tail. 2 other occupants escaped by parachute. Tragically, Davidson and Brown did not. News of the deaths landed on Astoria, already surrounded by flying saucers, intelligence officers' alleged warnings, and mysterious debris. Almost immediately, anonymous callers gave Tacoma newspapers a darker interpretation. One caller claimed the bomber had carried disc fragments, while other calls promoted claims that it had been shot down or sabotaged. Remarkably, a caller identified Davidson and Brown before Army authorities publicly released the dead officers' names. Initially, that sounds like knowledge belonging to someone deep inside the investigation. People involved in the Winthrop Hotel meetings, however, already knew who the officers were. More significantly, Ruppelt later wrote that one of the 2 men behind the Maury Island story had been the mysterious newspaper informer. Advanced knowledge, therefore, remains a striking detail, but it does not establish secret foreknowledge of the crash. Here is where the apparent conspiracy runs into its biggest problem. The closer investigators looked at the crash, the less mysterious the crash itself became. Crash investigators had a conventional failure sequence in front of them. Evidence in the FBI record describes an engine fire and structural breakup, while McCord intelligence reported no indication of sabotage. Perfect for suspicion was one unresolved detail: what happened to the alleged fragments. Earlier, the FBI witness account had placed the box inside the Army car with Davidson and Brown. Subsequently, an August 14th Bureau memorandum stated that the crashed aircraft was definitely not carrying parts of a disc, and found no substantiation for sabotage. Importantly, those statements are not necessarily contradictory. Fragments could have been left at McCord before takeoff, or otherwise separated from the officers before the flight. Frustratingly, the surviving public record does not provide a neat chain of custody, showing every handoff. By this stage, every uncertainty begins helping the story survive. A missing handoff leaves room for secret cargo rumors, the fatal crash makes earlier claims feel more consequential, and anonymous calls make coincidence look coordinated. Taken together, the sequence almost feels too connected to be accidental. Now, separate those links. Once each claim has to survive on its own evidence, Maury Island changes quickly. Start with the material, because physical debris should be the strongest part of a story about something supposedly falling from an unknown aircraft. Contemporary FBI material records a comparison between fragments associated with the case and slag near a Tacoma smelter, with the material described as distinctly similar. Ruppert later summarized the intelligence conclusion more directly: the fragments were slag. Worse for the extraordinary version, his account says both men admitted the rock fragments had nothing to do with flying saucers, and that the material had been sent to a publisher as a joke. Separate FBI material, likewise, record statements presenting the flying disc story as false. Most damagingly, none of the promised photographs became verifiable evidence. Edward Ruppelt, writing in 1956, after reviewing the official investigation, called the entire Maury Island story a hoax. His account also says Dahl's mysterious visitor did not exist, and that the classified material aboard the B-25 consisted of unrelated reports, not Maury Island wreckage. Case closed. Not entirely, because historical records can still be untidy, even when the broad explanation is strong. Elsewhere in the FBI material, one participant is described as saying that, if authorities questioned him, he would call the story a hoax, because he wanted no more trouble. Modern defenders have used that passage to argue that at least one apparent recantation may not be as straightforward as it first appears. Consider the date itself. Chronologically, Dahl placed his encounter on June 21st, 3 days before Arnold's Mount Rainier sighting. Documentary timing is less impressive, because Dahl and Crisman's story was reported only after Arnold's sighting had already reached national attention. Backdating an encounter requires only a claim. Proving it happened on that earlier date requires independent evidence the case does not provide. Likewise, photographs should have been decisive if they clearly showed 6 giant objects over Puget Sound. Publicly, those images never materialized as verifiable proof. Remove Dahl and Crisman from the original event, and almost nothing remains that independently establishes the aerial encounter. Arguably, the simplest reconstruction is a questionable flying disc story, built around ordinary material, amplified by a national saucer craze, and then permanently transformed by an unrelated fatal crash. Publicity gave the story reach, anonymous calls supplied menace, and the deaths of 2 investigators supplied something far more powerful, a real event that could be attached to an unproven one. Eventually, the central mystery changes. No longer is the strongest question whether 6 extraordinary craft hovered over Maury Island. Instead, the harder question is why evidence this fragile produced a legend this durable. Timing offers one answer. Tragedy is another. Fusion mattered most. The weakest part of Maury Island, the original sighting, became permanently attached to its strongest documented event, the deaths of Davidson and Brown. Still, one documentary gap remains worth acknowledging. Where exactly did the alleged fragments go after the box was placed in the Army vehicle outside the Winthrop Hotel? Perhaps they were left at McCord, discarded after inspection, or otherwise separated from the officers before takeoff. Nothing about that missing handoff proves a cover-up. Rather, it explains why later writers could keep asking whether something important disappeared between the hotel and the crash. Ultimately, Maury Island survives because incomplete paperwork leaves more room for mythology than complete paperwork ever could. Whichever version comes closest, the evidence supporting the UFO claim remains weak, while the mechanical explanation for the B-25 crash is well documented. Finally, one piece never becomes completely neat. Somebody recorded the alleged fragments entering the investigator's vehicle, while another federal record later stated that no disc parts were aboard the bomber when it crashed. Between those 2 records sits a missing handoff, probably mundane, certainly incomplete, and almost perfectly designed to keep suspicion alive. Until stronger contemporary evidence closes that gap, Maury Island remains less a mystery about what came from the sky than a mystery about what happened to a story after it reached the ground. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.